The late afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Catherine's Cathedral, casting rainbow prisms across the white marble floor where I stood frozen in disbelief. My hands trembled as they clutched the bouquet of white roses and baby's breath, the thorns pricking through my silk gloves with each labored breath. The scent of gardenias and vanilla candles that had seemed so romantic moments before now felt suffocating, mixing with the metallic taste of shock coating my tongue. "I can't do this anymore, Bella." David's voice echoed through the cathedral's vaulted ceiling, his words bouncing off stone walls that had witnessed countless vows of eternal love. "I'm in love with someone else. I have been for months." 500 guests sat in stunned silence behind us, their collective intake of breath creating a sound like wind rushing through autumn leaves. The weight of their stares pressed against my back like physical hands, each pair of eyes boring into my soul as my carefully constructed world crumbled. My ivory silk gown, which had taken 8 months to design and cost more than my teacher's salary for 3 months, suddenly felt like a costume in a play I no longer understood. The cathedral that had seemed so majestic when I'd walked down the aisle 10 minutes earlier now felt like a tomb. Gothic arches stretched impossibly high above us, their stone faces seeming to mock my humiliation. The altar where I'd dreamed of pledging my life to David now felt like a stage for my public execution. "Who?" The word escaped my lips as barely a whisper, though it seemed to reverberate through the sacred space. My throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming, though I hadn't raised my voice above normal speaking level. David's green eyes, the same ones I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago at the coffee shop near the elementary school where I taught, couldn't meet mine. His hands, which had proposed to me with my grandmother's ring just 18 months ago, fidgeted with his silver cufflinks. The tuxedo his mother had insisted on from that boutique in Manhattan suddenly looked like armor he was hiding behind. "Sarah," he said, and the name hit me like a physical blow. Sarah, my best friend since college, my maid of honor, who had helped me choose this dress, who had held my hair while I threw up from wedding nerves last week, who had sworn just this morning that I was the most beautiful bride she'd ever seen. I could hear her sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind me, could imagine her standing among my bridesmaids in the dusty rose dress we'd selected together. "Sarah Chen?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, hollow and strange. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear every small sound amplified, the soft rustle of silk and taffeta as guests shifted uncomfortably in their pews, the distant sound of traffic on Fifth Avenue filtering through the massive wooden doors, the almost inaudible hum of the air conditioning system trying to cool 500 bodies in formal wear. My legs felt like they might give out beneath me. The cathedral floor seemed to sway like the deck of a ship, and I had to consciously lock my knees to keep from collapsing. The weight of my veil, held in place by my mother's pearl comb, suddenly felt like it might drag me backward into the marble. "We didn't mean for it to happen," David continued, his words gaining strength as if confessing was lifting some great weight from his shoulders. "It just did. We tried to fight it, but love isn't something you can control." Love. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. What we'd had these past 3 years, what I'd thought was love, what had been real enough for me to say yes when he'd proposed on the beach in the Hamptons last summer, apparently wasn't love at all. At least not for him. I turned slightly, enough to see Sarah standing frozen among my bridesmaids. Her olive skin had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and her dark eyes were wide with what looked like genuine terror. The roses in her bouquet were trembling, a mirror of my own shaking hands. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, looking like a fish gasping for air. "How long?" I heard myself ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. 6 months, David admitted, and I felt something inside my chest crack like ice in warm water. 6 months, half a year of lies, 6 months of planning this wedding, of menu tastings and flower selections and dress fittings, while my fiancé was in love with my best friend. 6 months of me excitedly showing David every detail of our wedding plans while he was probably thinking about her. 6 months of Sarah listening to me gush about my dress, my flowers, my future, while she was betraying me in the most fundamental way possible. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was a teacher, someone whose job it was to shape young minds and help children understand the difference between right and wrong. And I hadn't seen this coming. I prided myself on being observant, on noticing when my students were struggling or when something was wrong at home. Yet I'd been blind to the 2 people closest to me falling in love behind my back. "The wedding is off," David announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making boardroom decisions. His family owned 3 successful restaurants in the city, and he'd inherited that natural command presence that had initially attracted me to him. Now it just felt like salt in an open wound. A collective murmur rose from the pews, 500 voices creating a sound like distant thunder. I could hear his mother's sharp gasp from the front row, could practically feel my own mother's humiliation radiating from where she sat in her carefully chosen mother-of-the-bride dress. All those people, all those expensive invitations, all that planning and preparation and hope, reduced to nothing in a matter of minutes. My bouquet slipped from my nerveless fingers, landing on the marble with a soft thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the echoing space. White rose petals scattered across the stone like tears, and the baby's breath looked suddenly like tiny bones. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. The death of everything I'd thought my life was going to be. I needed to leave. The thought penetrated the fog of shock that had settled over my mind like a thick blanket. I needed to get out of this cathedral, away from the stares and whispers and the crushing weight of public humiliation. But my feet felt rooted to the marble floor, as if the stone had reached up and claimed me. Just as I managed to take one shaky step backward, preparing to flee down the aisle past all those watching faces, a voice cut through the cathedral's stunned silence. "That's enough." The voice was deep, commanding, with the faintest trace of an Italian accent that turned simple words into music. It came from somewhere in the back of the cathedral, and something about its tone made every person in the building turn to look. Even David, who had been reaching toward me as if to comfort me, froze mid-gesture. I turned along with everyone else, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure people could hear it. Through the forest of turned heads and craning necks, I saw a man standing in the back pew. But from this distance, I couldn't make out his features clearly. What I could see was that he commanded attention effortlessly, that even from hundreds of feet away, his presence filled the space. "Who the hell?" David started, but the man was already moving. He walked down the center aisle with measured steps, his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble in a rhythm that seemed to match my racing heartbeat. The crowd parted before him like water, guests unconsciously leaning away as he passed. There was something about his movement that suggested coiled power, like a predator moving through tall grass. As he drew closer, details began to emerge from the blur of shock and distance. Tall, probably 6'3" or 4", with broad shoulders that filled out his perfectly tailored black suit. Dark hair swept back from a face that belonged in Renaissance paintings, all strong angles and classic Italian features. But it was his eyes that captured my attention and held it. Dark brown, almost black, and fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. I'd never seen him before in my life, yet something about him seemed familiar, like a half-remembered dream or a face glimpsed in a crowd. He stopped directly in front of the altar, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine with notes of sandalwood and spice. Close enough that I could see the perfect knot of his silk tie, the way his jacket fit without a single wrinkle, the glint of a gold watch at his wrist that probably cost more than my car. "Miss Winters," he said, and hearing my name in his voice sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. "You deserve so much better than this." The stranger's words hung in the cathedral air like incense, heavy and significant. David stepped forward, positioning himself between me and this unexpected intruder, his chest puffed out in what I recognized as his attempt to appear intimidating. It was the same posture he adopted when dealing with difficult restaurant vendors or arguing with his business partners. "Who are you?" David demanded, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. "This is a private matter. You need to leave immediately." The man smiled, and it was the kind of expression that never reached his eyes. There was something predatory about it, something that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up beneath the delicate lace sleeves of my gown. He reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness, and I heard several sharp intakes of breath from the gathered crowd. When his hand emerged, it held not a weapon, but a simple leather wallet. "Bruno Castellano," he introduced himself, flipping the wallet open to reveal what looked like a business card. "I believe you know me, David. Or rather, you know my accountants." The color drained from David's face so quickly I thought he might faint. His hands, which had been clenched into fists at his sides, began to tremble visibly. The confident businessman who had just humiliated me in front of 500 people suddenly looked like a frightened child caught stealing cookies. "I don't know what you're talking about," David stammered, but his voice carried no conviction. Bruno's smile widened, revealing perfect white teeth. $47,000, he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "That's what you owe my organization. Poker debts from the games at the Meridian Club. You've missed 3 payments." A collective gasp rippled through the cathedral. I felt my own mouth fall open in shock. David had gambling debts? To what organization? The Meridian Club was an exclusive gentlemen's club in Midtown that David had mentioned attending occasionally, but he'd always claimed it was for business networking. "This isn't the time or place," David hissed, glancing nervously at the crowd of wedding guests who were now leaning forward in their seats, straining to catch every word. "On the contrary," Bruno replied, his voice carrying easily through the vaulted space. "This is exactly the time and place. You see, when a man owes me money and then decides to publicly humiliate an innocent woman, it becomes my business." He turned to face me then, and the full force of his attention was like standing in front of a blazing fire. His dark eyes seemed to see straight through me, past the elaborate wedding dress and carefully applied makeup to something deeper. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler, though it still carried that underlying current of power. "Miss Winters, how long have you been teaching at Lincoln Elementary?" The question caught me completely off guard. What? How do you— 4 years. He answered his own question. "You teach 3rd grade. Your classroom is decorated with watercolor paintings your students made, and you stay late every Thursday to tutor children who are struggling with reading." My mouth went dry. How could this stranger possibly know such specific details about my life? "I don't understand." "The Castellano Foundation provides funding for the after-school art program at your school," Bruno explained, his eyes never leaving mine. "I've seen the reports. Your dedication to those children is remarkable." The Castellano Foundation. I'd heard the name mentioned in faculty meetings, knew that they provided grants for various educational programs throughout the city, but I'd never paid much attention to the source of the funding. Now, standing in my ruined wedding dress, while this mysterious man revealed intimate details about my professional life, I felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. "You've been watching me," I whispered, and something that might have been hurt flashed across his features. "Protecting you," he corrected softly. "For longer than you know." Before I could process what that meant, David stepped forward again, his face flushed with anger and something that looked like desperation. "Look, Castellano, I'll get you your money. Just not here, not now. This is my wedding." "No," Bruno interrupted, his voice hardening like steel. This is the day you chose to destroy the life of the most remarkable woman in this room. This is the day you decided that your gambling addiction was more important than the woman who loved you enough to plan a future with you. Gambling addiction. The words hit me like physical blows. Not only had David been lying about his relationship with Sarah, but he'd also been hiding a serious gambling problem. How had I been so blind? How had I missed such fundamental aspects of his character? I don't have an addiction, David protested weakly. Bruno reached into his jacket again, this time producing a folded piece of paper. Shall I read the list of debts you've accumulated over the past 18 months? The Meridian Club is just the beginning. There's also the matter of the $20,000 you borrowed from the Westside Casino, and the $15,000 from private games in Atlantic City. My knees nearly buckled. $82,000 in gambling debts, more than twice my annual salary. David had been living a completely double life, and I'd been none the wiser. The expensive dinners, the luxury vacation to Europe last summer, the designer engagement ring. How much of it had been funded by borrowed money? That's impossible, I heard myself say, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Too many things suddenly made sense. David's mysterious late nights at the office, his reluctance to discuss finances even as we planned our wedding, the way he'd insisted on handling all the payments for our honeymoon personally. I'm afraid it's very real, Bruno said gently, and it's not the worst of it. He turned back to David, and his expression shifted into something that made several people in the front pews actually lean back in their seats. Tell her about the life insurance policy, David. David's face went from pale to gray. I don't know what you mean. The $2 million policy you took out on Miss Winters 6 months ago, right around the time you started your affair with her best friend. The cathedral erupted. Gasps and exclamations rose from the assembled guests like birds taking flight. I heard my mother's sharp cry from the front row, heard someone behind me mutter, "Jesus Christ," under their breath. The sound seemed to echo endlessly off the stone walls, creating a cacophony of shock and disbelief. But all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. A life insurance policy. On me. Taken out 6 months ago, around the same time David had started sleeping with Sarah. The implication was so horrifying that my mind refused to process it completely. It's not what you think, David said, but his voice was barely above a whisper now. It's standard for engaged couples to— $2 million is standard? Bruno asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Without her knowledge? While you're planning to leave her for another woman? I couldn't breathe. The corset of my wedding dress, which had felt snug but manageable that morning, now seemed to be crushing my ribs. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision, and I swayed on my feet. Strong hands caught my arms, steadying me, and I realized that Bruno had moved to stand beside me. Easy, he murmured, his voice low enough that only I could hear. Breathe. Don't let him see you break. The warmth of his hands through the silk of my dress was strangely comforting, an anchor in the storm of revelations that was destroying everything I thought I knew about my life. I focused on breathing, on standing upright, on not collapsing in front of 500 people who had come to celebrate what they thought was the happiest day of my life. Miss Chen, Bruno called out, and I heard Sarah make a small, choked sound behind me. Perhaps you'd like to explain your role in this elaborate deception. I turned to look at Sarah for the first time since David's initial confession. She was standing frozen among my other bridesmaids, still holding her bouquet, mascara starting to streak down her cheeks. The dusty rose dress that had looked so elegant during our final fitting now seemed to mock the entire concept of friendship and loyalty. We never meant, she started, then stopped, her voice breaking completely. You never meant to what? Bruno asked with false gentleness. Fall in love with your best friend's fiancé? Or help him plan her death? The word death reverberated through the cathedral like a gunshot, Several women in the congregation screamed outright, and I heard the unmistakable sound of someone fainting. A heavy thud followed by concerned voices. The Gothic arches above us seemed to press down lower, as if the weight of Bruno's accusation was too much for even the ancient stone to bear. "That's insane," David said, but his voice cracked on the second word. "I would never hurt Bella. You love her money." Bruno cut him off coldly. "Or rather, you love what her death would provide. $2 million would certainly solve your gambling problems, more than enough to start fresh with Miss Chen somewhere far from here." I felt like I was watching this scene unfold from outside my own body, as if my consciousness had somehow separated from the physical form standing in the wedding dress. The woman who had woken up this morning excited about her wedding day. The woman who had spent an hour having her hair perfectly styled and her makeup applied felt like a stranger. That woman had believed she was loved, had believed she understood the man she was about to marry. "How?" The word escaped my lips before I could stop it. "How were you planning to—" I couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't bring myself to ask how the man I'd shared a bed with for 2 years had been planning to kill me. David's silence was answer enough, but Bruno apparently felt the need to fill in the details. "The honeymoon in Costa Rica," he said, his voice clinical and cold. "Remote location, plenty of opportunities for accidents, hiking trails with dangerous cliffs, rental cars with questionable brake systems, perhaps a tragic drowning in those beautiful but treacherous ocean currents." Each possibility he listed felt like a knife sliding between my ribs. The honeymoon I'd been so excited about, the 2 weeks in paradise that I'd been counting down to for months, had been planned as my execution. Every romantic detail, the private villa overlooking the Pacific, the remote beach where we'd planned to watch sunsets, the hiking excursions through the cloud forest, had been selected not for their beauty, but for their potential to hide murder. "Stop," I whispered, pressing my hands to my stomach as bile rose in my throat. "Please stop." Bruno's expression softened immediately. "I'm sorry. I know this is difficult to hear, but you needed to know the truth. How long have you known?" I asked, turning to face him fully. Up close, his features were even more striking. High cheekbones that belonged on classical sculptures, a strong jaw with just the faintest shadow of beard stubble, and those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "How long have you been watching me?" 3 years, he answered without hesitation. "Since the day you started teaching at Lincoln Elementary." 3 years. The entire duration of my relationship with David. "Why?" Something vulnerable flickered across his features before his mask of control slipped back into place. "My nephew attends your school, Antonio Castellano. You might know him as Tony." I did know Tony. A quiet, serious 8-year-old with dark eyes very similar to Bruno's. He was one of my best students, always turning in perfect homework and raising his hand eagerly to answer questions. But I'd never made the connection to the Castellano name on the foundation paperwork. "Tony talks about you constantly," Bruno continued, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time. "Miss Bella this, Miss Bella that. You're his favorite teacher, and according to him, you're the most beautiful woman in the world." Despite everything, the humiliation, the betrayal, the horrifying revelations about David's plans, I felt a small smile tug at my own lips. Tony was a special child, mature beyond his years, but still possessing that innocent wonder that made teaching 8-year-olds such a joy. "He's a wonderful student," I managed to say. "He's also very observant," Bruno said, his expression growing serious again. "He noticed when you started coming to school with bruises." My blood went cold. "What bruises?" "On your wrists. Small ones, barely visible under your sleeves. But Tony has been taught to notice such things. He was concerned about you, so he mentioned it to his uncle." I automatically looked down at my wrists, though they were currently hidden beneath the long lace sleeves of my wedding gown. I knew what Bruno was talking about, the finger-shaped marks that David had left during our increasingly frequent arguments about wedding expenses. He'd never hit me, never done anything I would have called abuse, but his grip had grown harder over the past few months, especially when he'd been drinking. I started looking into your relationship with David after that. Bruno continued. What I found concerned me greatly. You investigated my personal life? I should have been angry about the invasion of privacy, but I felt strangely numb to everything except the growing realization of how close I'd come to disaster. I investigated David's financial situation and discovered his gambling debts. Then I discovered the life insurance policy. When I found evidence that he was planning your honeymoon to a location with no extradition treaties and high rates of tourist accidents, I knew I had to act. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. You've been protecting me without my knowledge. I had my people keeping a discreet eye on you, yes, making sure you were safe, gathering evidence of David's true intentions. He paused, studying my face. I never intended for it to come to this. I hoped David would call off the wedding on his own when the pressure of his debts became too much. But he didn't. No, instead, he accelerated his timeline. The wedding was supposed to be his perfect cover, grieving widower, seeking solace in the arms of his late wife's best friend. Very romantic, very tragic, very believable. I looked over at Sarah, who was now crying openly, her carefully applied makeup streaming down her face in dark rivulets. Did you know? I asked her directly. Did you know about the insurance policy? Sarah's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. No, I never. David said you were growing apart anyway, that you weren't happy. That's not what I asked, I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. Did you know about the policy? I knew about some policy, but I thought it was normal for married couples. We're not married, I interrupted, and $2 million isn't normal for anyone. I didn't know about the amount, Sarah whispered. I swear I didn't know about the amount or about the other thing. The other thing. Murder. She couldn't even say the word. Bruno stepped closer to me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Miss Winters, you need to understand that you're still in danger. David's debts haven't disappeared, and desperate men do desperate things. Well, what are you saying? I'm saying that even though his original plan has been exposed, he may still try to collect on that insurance policy. You can't go home. You can't return to your normal life. Not yet. The full weight of my situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. My fiancé had tried to have me killed. My best friend had betrayed me. And now this stranger, this man who had apparently been watching me for 3 years, was telling me I couldn't even go home to my own apartment. Then what am I supposed to do? I asked, my voice breaking for the first time since this nightmare had begun. Bruno reached into his jacket one final time, producing a small black card with silver lettering. You come with me. I stared at the card, which contained only a phone number and an address. Come with you where? Somewhere safe. Somewhere David and his associates can't reach you while I clean up this mess. Associates? The word sent a fresh chill down my spine. What associates? The kind of men who don't take kindly to unpaid debts. The kind of men who would be very interested to know about a $2 million life insurance policy on a woman whose husband owes them money. I closed my eyes, trying to process everything that had happened in the space of 20 minutes. This morning, I'd been a bride preparing for the happiest day of her life. Now I was apparently the target of a murder plot involving gambling debts and life insurance fraud. When I opened my eyes again, Bruno was watching me with an expression that was difficult to read. There was concern there, and what looked like genuine caring. But there was also something else, something deeper and more complex. Why should I trust you? I asked, I don't even know you. Because, he said simply, I'm the only one who's been telling you the truth. The cathedral had grown so quiet that I could hear the faint sound of traffic from Fifth Avenue filtering through the massive doors. 500 wedding guests sat in absolute silence, watching this surreal drama unfold before their eyes like some twisted theatrical performance. The weight of their collective gaze pressed against my shoulders, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt oddly calm. Bruno stood before me, his hand extended, offering an escape from a life that had revealed itself to be built entirely on lies. Behind me, David and Sarah represented everything I'd thought I wanted: love, friendship, a normal life in the suburbs with children and soccer games and PTA meetings. But that future had been an illusion, a beautiful facade hiding something rotten underneath. I need a moment, I said, my voice steadier than it had been since David's confession began this horror show. I need to think. Bruno nodded and lowered his hand, but he didn't step away. Of course, but please understand that time is a luxury we don't have much of. I looked out over the sea of faces in the pews. My mother sat in the front row, her face a mask of shock and confusion. She'd spent $30,000 on this wedding, money she could barely afford on her nurse's salary. My father, who had walked me down this aisle just half an hour ago, with tears of pride in his eyes, looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 20 minutes. In the third row, I spotted my colleagues from Lincoln Elementary. Mrs. Rodriguez, the principal, sat with her mouth hanging open. Next to her, Jennifer and Amanda from the 4th grade team looked like they were watching a car accident in slow motion. These people had come to celebrate with me, had taken time out of their Saturday to witness what they thought would be the beginning of my happily ever after. Instead, they'd gotten front row seats to the most spectacular public humiliation in New York wedding history. The police, I said suddenly, turning back to Bruno. Shouldn't we call the police? If David really was planning to kill me. With what evidence? Bruno asked gently. A life insurance policy is legal. Planning a honeymoon to Costa Rica is legal. Even gambling debts are legal if inadvisable. But you said you had evidence. I have suspicions and circumstances. I have a pattern of behavior that suggests intent. But unless David actually attempts to harm you, the police can't act on my concerns. The futility of my situation settled over me like a lead blanket. David had been planning my murder with what sounded like meticulous care, but until he actually tried to kill me, he was legally untouchable, and if he succeeded in his attempt, I wouldn't be around to press charges. What about the gambling debts? I asked. Isn't that something the police would be interested in? Bruno's smile was genuinely amused. Miss Winters, gambling debts are a civil matter, not a criminal one. My organization operates several legitimate businesses. The loans we make are properly documented and completely legal. Something about the way he said, legitimate businesses, made me wonder what his illegitimate businesses might involve. But I decided that was a question for another time. Right now, I needed to focus on the immediate problem of staying alive. If I go with you, I said slowly, what exactly does that mean? Am I your prisoner, your guest, your responsibility? You're under my protection, Bruno replied, and something in his voice made the distinction sound important. That means no one can harm you without answering to me. It means you'll be safe, comfortable, and free to make your own choices about your future. But not free to leave. He was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. Not immediately, no. David knows where you live, where you work, who your friends are. Until I can neutralize the threat he represents, it wouldn't be safe for you to return to your normal life. I glanced over at David, who was standing frozen near the altar like a deer caught in headlights. His expensive tuxedo was wrinkled now, and sweat stains had appeared under his arms despite the cathedral's air conditioning. This was the man I'd planned to spend my life with. The man I'd trusted with my heart and my future. Looking at him now, I tried to remember what I'd seen in him, what had made me fall in love. He'd been charming, certainly. Successful, or so I'd thought. He'd made me laugh, had been attentive and romantic during our courtship. But had any of it been real? Or had I been just another mark in some elaborate long-term con game? "David," I said, and he looked up at me with what might have been hope in his eyes. "Look me in the eye and tell me you never planned to hurt me." He opened his mouth immediately, the denial clearly ready on his lips, but something in my expression must have stopped him. We stared at each other across the space between us, and I watched as the last of his pretenses crumbled away. He started, then stopped. His shoulders sagged, and suddenly he looked like a broken man rather than a confident businessman. "I was in so deep, Bella. You don't understand the kind of people I owe money to. They were going to kill me. So you decided to let them kill me instead. It wasn't supposed to be like that. It was supposed to look like an accident. You wouldn't have suffered." "Stop talking," I said sharply, cutting him off before he could make it worse. "Just stop." The admission hung in the air between us like poison gas. Even though I'd already known the truth, hearing him confirm it still felt like being stabbed. The man I'd loved had been planning to murder me to solve his financial problems. The man I'd trusted with my life had been willing to take that life to save his own skin. I turned back to Bruno, who had been watching this exchange with dark eyes that missed nothing. "If I go with you, what happens to him?" "That depends on him," Bruno replied. "If he cooperates with my efforts to clean up this situation, if he provides full information about his debts and his contacts, he might live through this experience. And if he doesn't cooperate?" Bruno's expression didn't change, but something cold and final flickered in his eyes. "Then he won't." I should have been horrified by the casual way he discussed David's potential death. I should have been appalled by the implied violence, should have insisted that we contact the authorities instead of handling this through whatever shadowy methods Bruno had in mind. But all I felt was a strange sense of relief that someone was finally taking charge of the situation. "Sarah," I called out, and my former best friend looked up with tears streaming down her face. "Were you ever really my friend?" "Yes," she whispered. "I swear to you, Bella, I was. I am. I never meant for any of this to happen. But you let it happen anyway." She had no answer for that, which was answer enough. I looked down at my left hand, where my grandmother's engagement ring caught the cathedral's stained glass light, and threw it back in rainbow fragments. The ring that had belonged to a woman who'd been married to the same man for 67 years, who'd believed in true love and forever promises. I slipped it off my finger and held it out to David. "This belongs to my family," I said, "not to yours." He took the ring with shaking hands, and I noticed that his fingers were trembling almost as badly as mine had been earlier. "Bella, please. I know I messed up, but we can work through this. You tried to have me killed," I said simply. "There's no working through that." I turned back to Bruno, who was waiting patiently for my decision. His dark eyes were warm with something that looked like understanding, and when he extended his hand again, it felt like a lifeline. "If I go with you," I said, "I want your word that you won't hurt David unless he tries to hurt me first." Bruno considered this for a moment, then nodded. "You have it. And I want to know exactly what kind of protection you're offering and what the terms are." "Agreed." I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of gardenias and candle wax and the faint cologne that clung to Bruno's skin. Behind me, I could feel the weight of 500 pairs of eyes, could practically hear the gossip that would spread through the city's social circles before the sun set. Bella Winters, left at the altar by her cheating fiancé, rescued by a mysterious stranger who might or might not be connected to organized crime. It sounded like the plot of a romance novel, not like real life. But then again, my real life had turned out to be stranger than any fiction I'd ever read. I placed my hand in Bruno's, and his fingers closed around mine with gentle strength. "Okay," I said. "I'll go with you." The warmth of his smile was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "You won't regret this choice." As he led me down the center aisle past the sea of shocked faces, past my parents and my colleagues and all the witnesses to this spectacular disaster, I couldn't help but wonder if I already did. But as we reached the massive cathedral doors, and Bruno's driver stepped forward to open them, I realized that regret was a luxury I couldn't afford. The woman who had walked down this aisle an hour ago in a cloud of romantic dreams was gone forever. Whatever came next, whoever I was about to become, at least I would be alive to find out. The late afternoon sun hit my face as we stepped outside, and for the first time in hours, I could breathe freely. Behind us, the cathedral doors closed with a sound like thunder, sealing away the wreckage of my former life. Ahead of us, a sleek black sedan waited at the curb, its engine purring with expensive precision. "Where are we going?" I asked as Bruno helped me into the back seat, gathering the layers of my wedding dress so they wouldn't catch in the door. "Home," he said simply, sliding in beside me. But as the car pulled away from the cathedral and into the flow of Manhattan traffic, I realized that I no longer had any idea what that word meant. The drive through Manhattan passed in a blur of afternoon sunlight, and city sounds filtered through the sedan's tinted windows. I sat in the back seat beside Bruno, acutely aware of the rustling silk of my wedding dress every time I moved, the weight of my veil still pinned to my hair with my mother's pearl comb. The elaborate updo that had taken my stylist 2 hours to perfect this morning now felt like a costume I was wearing in someone else's play. Bruno had made several phone calls during the drive, speaking in rapid Italian to people whose names I didn't recognize. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them followed without question. Occasionally, he would glance at me during these conversations, his dark eyes checking to make sure I was all right, but he didn't attempt to include me in the discussions. I was grateful for the respite, for the chance to process everything that had happened without having to respond or react. The neighborhood gradually changed as we drove north from Midtown. Glass towers gave way to tree-lined streets, crowded sidewalks to quieter residential blocks. We passed through the Upper East Side, then continued north until the city itself began to fade into something more suburban and green. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked when Bruno finished his latest call. "My family's estate in Westchester," he replied, tucking his phone back into his jacket pocket. "It's private, secure, and completely off any grid that David might have access to." Family estate. The words conjured images of old money and European ancestry, of the kind of wealth that built institutions and influenced policy rather than simply buying expensive toys. I tried to imagine what kind of home a man like Bruno Castellano might live in, but my frame of reference was limited to the modest apartment I rented in Queens and the suburban house where I'd grown up. "How long will I need to stay there?" I asked. "That depends on several factors," Bruno said carefully. "How quickly we can resolve David's debt situation, how cooperative he chooses to be, whether any of his creditors decide to pursue alternative collection methods." Alternative collection methods. Another euphemism for violence, I assumed. The world I was entering seemed to operate on carefully coded language, where direct statements were replaced by implications and suggestions. I supposed it was a necessary adaptation when your business dealings occasionally ventured into legally questionable territory. The sedan turned through an impressive set of iron gates that opened automatically as we approached. A long driveway wound through mature trees and expertly landscaped gardens, giving me glimpses of manicured lawns and flower beds that probably required a full-time groundskeeping staff to maintain. After several minutes of driving through what felt like a private park, the house finally came into view. Calling it a house was like calling the cathedral where I'd just been humiliated a church. Technically accurate, but woefully inadequate to describe the scale and grandeur of the structure. The Castellano estate was a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa that looked like it had been transplanted directly from the Italian countryside. Warm stone walls rose 3 stories, covered in climbing ivy and punctuated by arched windows with elaborate wrought-iron details. A circular fountain dominated the front courtyard, its gentle splashing providing a peaceful soundtrack to our arrival. "It's beautiful," I said, and meant it. Despite my circumstances, despite the surreal nature of the day, I couldn't help but appreciate the obvious care and attention that had gone into creating this space. "My grandfather built it in the 1940s, Bruno said, a note of pride creeping into his voice. He wanted to recreate the villa where he grew up in Tuscany, but on a larger scale. The driver opened my door, and Bruno stepped out before walking around to help me from the car. The layers of silk and tulle that made up my wedding dress required careful maneuvering, and I was grateful for his steadying hand as I navigated the transition from seated to standing. The afternoon air was cooler here than it had been in the city, carrying the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. A woman emerged from the house as we approached the front entrance. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and kind eyes that assessed me with professional interest. Her simple black dress and comfortable shoes suggested she was part of the household staff, but her bearing indicated she held a position of considerable authority. "Miss Winters," Bruno said. "This is Maria Santos, my housekeeper. Maria has been with my family for 30 years, and she'll take excellent care of you." Maria stepped forward with a warm smile. "Welcome to Via Castellano, Miss Winters. I'm so sorry to meet you under such difficult circumstances." The genuine sympathy in her voice nearly brought tears to my eyes. After hours of shock and betrayal and confusion, simple human kindness felt like a balm on raw wounds. "Thank you," I managed to say. "I appreciate your hospitality, though I'm afraid I'm not exactly dressed for a house visit." Maria's smile widened. "Don't you worry about that, dear. We'll have you out of that dress and into something comfortable in no time. Mr. Bruno called ahead to let me know you'd be staying with us for a while." A while could mean anything from a few days to several months, depending on how long it took to resolve the disaster that my life had become. The uncertainty should have bothered me more than it did, but I found myself oddly relieved to have decisions taken out of my hands for the moment. The past few hours had required more emotional processing than I felt capable of handling. Bruno led us into the house, and I found myself in an entrance hall that belonged in a museum. The ceiling soared 2 stories above us, supported by carved wooden beams that had probably been crafted by artisans who learned their trade from their fathers and grandfathers. A sweeping staircase curved upward to the 2nd floor, its wrought-iron banister and work of art in itself. Paintings that looked suspiciously like originals hung on the walls between niches that held classical sculptures. "Your room is ready upstairs," Maria said, already moving toward the staircase. "I've laid out some clothes that should fit you until we can arrange for your own things to be brought over." The mention of my own things reminded me that I had an entire life I'd left behind at the cathedral. My purse was still in the bridal suite where I'd gotten ready this morning. My car was parked in the lot behind the church. My apartment contained everything I owned in the world except for the wedding dress I was currently wearing. "I should call my parents," I said suddenly. "They're probably worried sick." Bruno nodded. "Of course. There's a phone in your room and Maria can help you with anything you need." As we climbed the staircase, I caught glimpses of other rooms through open doorways. A library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a formal dining room with a table that could easily seat 20 people, a living room with furniture that looked both antique and comfortable. Everything spoke of old money and established taste, of a family that had been wealthy for generations rather than one that had recently acquired their fortune. The room Maria showed me to was larger than my entire apartment. French doors opened onto a private balcony overlooking the gardens, and the afternoon sun streamed through white curtains that fluttered in the gentle breeze. A king-sized bed dominated one wall, its linens crisp and white and inviting, An antique armoire stood opposite, its doors open to reveal an array of clothing in what appeared to be my size. "How did you know what size to get?" I asked, running my hand over a soft cashmere sweater. Maria exchanged a glance with Bruno. "Mr. Bruno has very good judgment about such things," she said diplomatically. The implication was clear. Bruno had been observing me closely enough to accurately estimate my clothing size. It should have been creepy, but given that his observation had probably saved my life, I found myself oddly grateful for his attention to detail. "I'll leave you to get settled," Bruno said from the doorway. "Maria will show you where everything is, and dinner will be ready whenever you're comfortable. There's no rush." After he left, Maria helped me out of the wedding dress with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with elaborate formal wear before. The process of removing the dozens of tiny buttons and complex undergarments felt symbolic, like shedding not just clothing, but the entire identity of the woman who had put them on that morning. When I was finally free of the silken tool, Maria hung the dress carefully in the armoire. "We'll have it cleaned and preserved," she said. "You may want to keep it someday, even if the memories associated with it aren't pleasant." I doubted I would ever want to see the dress again, but I appreciated her thoughtfulness. She helped me select comfortable clothes from the armoire. Soft jeans that fit perfectly, a cream-colored sweater that felt like a hug, and slippers that were exactly my shoe size. The accuracy of Bruno's estimates was becoming increasingly impressive and slightly unnerving. "There's a private bathroom through that door," Maria explained, "and if you need anything at all, just pick up the phone and dial 0. Someone will always answer." When I was finally alone, I sank into the chair by the French doors and tried to process everything that had happened. 12 hours ago, I had been a woman preparing for her wedding day, excited about her future and secure in her relationships. Now I was essentially a refugee, hiding in a stranger's house because my fiancé had tried to have me killed. The phone call to my parents was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. My mother cried, my father raged, and both of them demanded to know where I was and when I was coming home. I gave them the basics, that I was safe, that I was staying with someone who could protect me, that I would call again soon. But I couldn't bring myself to explain the full scope of David's betrayal. The life insurance policy, the planned murder, the connection to organized crime, it all sounded too fantastic to be real, even though I had witnessed it myself. When I finally hung up the phone, emotionally exhausted, there was a soft knock at my door. Bruno stood in the hallway, now changed out of his formal suit into dark jeans and a white button-down shirt that made him look younger and somehow more approachable. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm not sure," I answered honestly. "It feels like I'm living someone else's life." "That's not an uncommon feeling when your world changes suddenly," he said. "It takes time to adjust to new circumstances." He spoke with the authority of someone who had experienced dramatic upheavals in his own life. I found myself curious about his story, about how he had come to be the kind of man who could casually dismantle someone's murder plot in the middle of a wedding ceremony. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Anything." "Why did you help me? Really? It can't just be because of Tony's concerns about bruises on my wrists." Bruno was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying my face as if trying to decide how much truth to share. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I had heard it before. "Because I've been half in love with you for 3 years," he said simply. "And I couldn't stand by and watch someone hurt you." The words hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Bruno's confession should have alarmed me. The idea that this powerful, dangerous man had been harboring feelings for me while I lived my life completely unaware of his existence. Instead, I felt something warm and unexpected unfurling in my chest, a flutter of possibility in the midst of so much destruction. 3 years, I repeated, trying to process the timeline. Since I started teaching at Lincoln Elementary. "Since the first day," he confirmed, leaning against the doorframe with a casualness that didn't quite mask the vulnerability in his dark eyes. "I came to observe the after-school program that the foundation was funding. You were working with a group of children who were struggling with reading, and you had this way of making each of them feel like they were the most important person in the world." I remembered that day vaguely. It had been early in the school year, and I'd been nervous about the new reading intervention program. A man in an expensive suit had observed from the back of the classroom for about 20 minutes, but I'd assumed he was from the district office or the state education department. "That was you," I said, the memory clicking into place. "That was me. You were wearing a blue dress with tiny flowers on it, and you had chalk on your fingers from writing encouragement on the whiteboard. When little Marcus finally managed to sound out the word butterfly after struggling with it for weeks, you smiled like he'd just discovered electricity." The specificity of his memory took my breath away. I did remember Marcus, a quiet third grader who had been reading below grade level and was convinced he was stupid. It had taken weeks of patient work to build his confidence, and when he finally had that breakthrough moment, I had felt like cheering. "You've been watching me for 3 years," I said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Not watching," Bruno corrected gently. "Protecting. There's a difference." "Is there?" He pushed off from the doorframe and stepped into the room, his presence immediately making the large space feel smaller and more intimate. "Watching would be invasive, selfish. Protecting means ensuring you're safe while respecting your autonomy and privacy. Until today." "Until today," he agreed. "When your autonomy and privacy became less important than your life." I stood from the chair by the French doors and moved to the window, looking out over the gardens that stretched toward the tree line in the distance. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been romantic under different circumstances. As it was, the beauty felt almost surreal, like I was viewing it from inside a snow globe. "What happens now?" I asked, not turning around. "With David, with the debts, with all of it?" "David will provide us with a complete list of his creditors and the amounts he owes," Bruno said, his voice taking on a businesslike tone. "We'll negotiate payment plans or settlements where possible and handle the situations that require more direct intervention." More direct intervention. There was that coded language again, the euphemisms that danced around the darker aspects of Bruno's world. And if he doesn't cooperate, he will. The certainty in Bruno's voice suggested that David's cooperation wasn't really optional. I found that I cared less about David's fate than I probably should have. The man who had tried to have me killed for insurance money had forfeited any claim to my sympathy or concern. What about the life insurance policy? Already canceled. The insurance company was very understanding when we explained that the policy had been taken out under fraudulent circumstances. I turned to face him, surprised by how quickly he had moved to address that particular threat. "How did you manage that?" Bruno's smile was slight but satisfied. "The Castellano family has many friends in many industries. Sometimes those friendships prove mutually beneficial." The casual way he mentioned his family's influence reminded me that I was now under the protection of people who operated on a level of power and wealth that was completely foreign to my experience. It was both comforting and slightly terrifying to know that Bruno could make problems disappear with a few phone calls. "And what about me?" I asked. "What happens to my life? My job? My apartment?" "Your job will be held for you," Bruno said. "I've spoken with Mrs. Rodriguez, and she understands that you're dealing with a family emergency that requires you to take extended leave. Your apartment is being watched to ensure David doesn't attempt to retrieve anything or leave any unpleasant surprises." The thoroughness of his preparations was impressive and slightly overwhelming. In the space of a few hours, he had managed to secure my employment, protect my home, and neutralize the immediate threats to my safety. It should have made me feel grateful, but instead, it emphasized how completely my life was now in his hands. You've thought of everything, I said. I try to be thorough when it comes to things that matter to me. The weight of his words settled over me like a warm blanket. I mattered to him. This man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure, who could make insurance policies disappear and gambling debts vanish, who lived in a house that looked like it belonged in architectural magazines. He cared about me. Why? I asked softly. Why do I matter to you? Bruno moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the faint lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than his serious demeanor would indicate. Because you're genuine in a world full of people wearing masks. Because you care about children who aren't your own and take pride in their successes as if they were your greatest achievements. Because you see the best in people even when they don't deserve it. His hand came up to touch my face, his fingers tracing the line of my cheek with surprising gentleness. Because when you smile, it lights up everything around you. And because I've spent 3 years imagining what it would be like to protect you, to care for you, to love you the way you deserve to be loved. My breath caught in my throat. The intensity in his dark eyes was almost overwhelming, a heat that seemed to see straight through to my soul. This was desire, but it was more than that. It was devotion, pure and consuming, and slightly terrifying in its scope. Bruno, I whispered, not sure what I wanted to say. I know this is overwhelming, he said, his thumb brushing across my lower lip. I know you need time to process everything that's happened. I'm not asking you to return my feelings or make any decisions about the future. I'm just asking you to let me take care of you while you heal from what David did. The offer was tempting beyond words. The idea of being cared for, of having someone else shoulder the burden of decisions and responsibilities while I figured out how to rebuild my life, was seductive in a way that had nothing to do with physical attraction. Though the physical attraction was definitely there. A slow burn that had been building since the moment he'd walked down the cathedral aisle to rescue me. What if I can't? I asked. What if I can't heal from this? Can't learn to trust again? Then I'll wait, Bruno said simply, however long it takes. Before I could respond, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to my forehead in a kiss that was tender rather than passionate, protective rather than possessive. It was the kind of gesture that spoke of infinite patience and deep caring, and it made my heart ache with emotions I wasn't ready to name. Dinner will be ready in an hour, he said, stepping back and giving me space to breathe. Maria's made osso buco, and she'll be offended if you don't at least try it. After he left, I sank back into the chair by the window and tried to make sense of the day's events. This morning I had been a woman preparing to marry a man I thought I loved, planning a future that seemed safe and predictable. Tonight, I was under the protection of a man who had just confessed to being in love with me for years, a man whose world operated by rules I didn't understand, but whose presence made me feel safer than I had in months. The rational part of my mind insisted that I should be terrified. I was essentially a prisoner in the home of a man connected to organized crime, dependent on his goodwill for my safety and survival. The power dynamic was so skewed in his favor that any relationship between us would be fundamentally unequal. But the rational part of my mind was being steadily overwhelmed by other considerations. Bruno had saved my life. He had exposed David's betrayal when no one else had even suspected it existed. He had shown me more genuine care and protection in one afternoon than David had managed in 3 years of supposed love. And there was something about the way Bruno looked at me that made me feel truly seen for the first time in my adult life. Not as a convenient girlfriend or a useful accessory, but as someone valuable in her own right, someone worth protecting, worth cherishing, worth loving. As the sun set over the gardens and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I found myself wondering what it would be like to live in a world where someone loved me the way Bruno claimed to love me. Not the conditional, self-serving love that David had offered, but something deeper and more permanent. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Maria peered in with a warm smile. "Dinner is ready, dear. Mr. Bruno is waiting for you in the small dining room." I followed her downstairs to a cozy room that was a far cry from the formal dining space I had glimpsed earlier. This room was designed for intimate meals, with a table for 4 and French doors that opened onto a terrace overlooking the gardens. Candles flickered on the table, and the scent of herbs and wine filled the air. Bruno stood when I entered, and I noticed that he had changed again, now wearing a dark sweater that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the strong line of his jaw. He looked relaxed and approachable, more like a successful businessman than a figure from organized crime. "How are you feeling?" he asked as he held my chair for me. "Like I'm living in someone else's life," I answered honestly. "But better. Safer." His smile was warm with satisfaction. "Good. That was the goal." The meal was extraordinary. Also buco that fell off the bone, risotto that was perfectly creamy, and vegetables that had clearly been picked from someone's garden that very day. We talked about neutral topics: books, travel, my experiences teaching. Bruno was an engaging conversationalist, well-read and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that surprised me. It wasn't until we were sharing a dessert of tiramisu that had probably been made by someone who learned the recipe from their Italian grandmother that I worked up the courage to ask the question that had been weighing on my mind. "What exactly do you do, Bruno? I mean, I know about the foundation and the legitimate businesses, but what about the rest of it?" He was quiet for a moment, considering how much truth to share. "My family has been in business for 4 generations, he said finally. "We started as importers, bringing goods from Italy to America. Over time, we diversified into other areas: construction, waste management, labor relations. Labor relations, another euphemism I suspected. And the gambling debts, the loans? Sometimes people need money quickly, and traditional banks aren't able to help them. We provide alternative financing options. At higher interest rates." "Considerably higher," he confirmed without apology. "The higher rates reflect the increased risk of lending to people with poor credit or unstable income." "And when people can't pay?" Bruno's expression grew serious. "We work with them to find solutions that benefit everyone involved. Violence is bad for business and draws unwanted attention from law enforcement." I believed him mostly. Bruno struck me as a pragmatist rather than a sadist, someone who would use intimidation and influence before resorting to actual violence. But I also wasn't naive enough to think that his world was free from danger or moral ambiguity. "Are you afraid of me, Bella?" he asked quietly. I considered the question seriously, examining my feelings rather than giving an automatic response. "I should be," I said finally, "but I'm not. I probably should be more concerned about the implications of being under the protection of someone in your line of work. But honestly, after what David was planning to do to me, your world seems almost refreshingly honest." Bruno laughed, a rich sound that transformed his entire face. "Refreshingly honest. I've never heard organized crime described quite that way before." "At least you're upfront about what you are," I said. "David spent 3 years lying to me about everything: his finances, his feelings, his intentions. You've been more honest with me in 1 day than he was in 3 years. Honesty is a luxury I can afford with you," Bruno said. "I don't need to pretend to be something I'm not to win your affection." The implication was clear. He was confident enough in his own appeal that he didn't need to resort to deception. It should have struck me as arrogant, but instead I found it refreshing. After years of David's subtle manipulations and half-truths, Bruno's directness was like breathing clean air. As the evening wound down and fatigue began to set in, I found myself reluctant to end the conversation, for the first time since the nightmare had begun at the cathedral. I felt almost normal, like a woman having dinner with an attractive man, rather than a refugee hiding from would-be murderers. "I should let you get some rest," Bruno said, rising from his chair as I stifled a yawn. "It's been a long day." The understatement of the century, I thought. "Bruno," I said as he moved to escort me back to my room. "Thank you. For everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." He stopped walking and turned to face me, his dark eyes serious. "You don't owe me anything, Bella. Protecting you isn't a transaction. It's a privilege." In that moment, standing in the candlelit dining room of his family's estate, I felt something shift inside my chest. The walls I had built around my heart after David's betrayal began to crack, letting in the possibility that not all men were liars, that not all love was selfish. Bruno Castellano was dangerous, complicated, and completely outside my experience. But he was also the man who had saved my life, who looked at me like I was precious, and who had just declared his intention to protect me without asking for anything in return. As he walked me to my room and bid me good night with another gentle kiss on my forehead, I found myself wondering if maybe, just maybe, the worst day of my life might also be the beginning of something extraordinary.